I speak 9 languages. The black waitress said it quietly. The billionaire CEO went pale. Why did those quiet words make a billionaire CEO suddenly go pale? And what could speaking 9 languages possibly mean in that moment? Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. We're so glad to have you here for another powerful and emotional story. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest stories. Thank you for being here, for watching, and for continuing to support our channel. Your support truly means so much to us. Now, tell us in the comments. If someone quietly revealed they could speak 9 languages, would you expect it to surprise a billionaire CEO? With that said, let's step into the beginning of this unforgettable story and discover what happens next. Don't sign that contract, sir. The words were barely louder than a whisper, yet they cut through the private dining room of the Manhattan restaurant like a bell in a silent church. Ethan Caldwell's hand stopped above the final page of a $900 million technology agreement. Around the polished walnut table, executives in tailored suits turned toward the voice they had spent the entire evening ignoring. It belonged to Avery Bennett, a 26-year-old black waitress holding a silver tray against her hip. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The chandelier light shimmered across crystal glasses. A soft piano melody drifted from the main dining room. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan glittered beneath the night sky. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes. He was the billionaire CEO of Caldwell Innovations, a man whose signature could move markets and whose approval could change careers. He looked at Avery as though trying to understand why a waitress had interrupted the most important business dinner of his year. "Excuse me?" he asked. Avery swallowed, but she didn't step back. "I said, please don't sign it yet." A few executives exchanged amused looks. One of them leaned toward another and whispered, "Does she even understand what she's looking at?" Avery heard him. She heard everything. She simply didn't react. That was something she had learned long before she ever entered a restaurant like this. People often decided what you were before you ever opened your mouth. At the Caldwell dinner, they had decided Avery was invisible. She was the woman who refilled water glasses, cleared plates, and quietly disappeared whenever important conversations began. They didn't know that she had spent years teaching herself languages late at night at a small kitchen table in Queens. They didn't know that she could move between English, Spanish, French, Mandarin, Japanese, Arabic, Portuguese, German, and Italian with remarkable ease. And they certainly didn't know why she had never told anyone. Ethan tapped the contract with one finger. "You think there's a problem?" Avery looked at the document, then at the foreign executives seated across from him. Her voice remained calm. "I think the English translation says one thing. The original language says something very different." The room changed. The executive who had laughed moments earlier stopped smiling. Ethan's expression tightened. "How would you know that?" Avery lowered her eyes for a moment. Not from shame, from restraint. Then she answered with quiet certainty. "Because I speak 9 languages." Silence. Complete silence. Even the piano seemed distant now. Ethan stared at her. For the first time that night, he wasn't looking at a waitress. He was looking at the one person in the room who might understand the deal better than everyone sitting at the table. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the color drained from his face. For the first time that evening, Ethan Caldwell stopped looking at his watch. He looked at Avery, not at the tray in her hand, not at the pressed black uniform. At her. The room remained perfectly still as Ethan pulled the contract closer. "Explain," he said. Avery glanced toward the executive who had questioned her. "The translation on page 47 says the licensing rights remain with your company for 10 years. But the original clause says the rights can be reviewed after 18 months. A murmur moved around the table. Ethan's chief legal officer, Martin Hayes, immediately reached for the document. "That is not possible. Our translation team reviewed this twice." Avery did not argue. She simply pointed to a line near the bottom of the page. "The wording is subtle. In English, it sounds like a routine review. In the original language, it gives the other company an option to renegotiate the entire agreement." Ethan leaned forward. His confidence had not disappeared, but something had changed behind his eyes. "How certain are you?" Avery answered without hesitation. Completely certain. Martin looked irritated. Miss Bennett, with respect, you are a restaurant employee. We have attorneys who specialize in international contracts. Avery lowered her tray onto an empty side table. I know. Her voice was soft. That is why I almost stayed quiet. The sentence landed harder than an argument would have. Ethan looked around the room. Every person at the table suddenly seemed aware of the same uncomfortable truth. They had not asked Avery what she knew. They had assumed she knew nothing. 10 minutes earlier, she had been invisible. Now every eye was following her. Ethan opened the original document on his tablet and compared the two versions. His legal officer moved closer. One of the foreign executives began speaking rapidly in his native language, apparently asking why a waitress was involved in the discussion. Avery understood every word. She kept her expression calm. Ethan noticed. What did he say? He asked. Avery hesitated. He asked why you were listening to me. Ethan looked at the executive, then back at Avery. And what did you say? Nothing. Why? Avery gave a small, almost tired smile. Because he was not speaking to me. For a moment, Ethan said nothing. Then he asked the question that had been forming in his mind since she first spoke. Where did you learn all these languages? Avery picked up the tray again, but she did not walk away. My mother taught me Spanish. She worked nights as a translator. When I was growing up, she used to tell me that another language was another way of seeing the world. Ethan listened. And the others? Libraries, community classes, free online lessons, practice, a lot of mistakes. Her answer was simple. There was no performance in it, no attempt to impress anyone. That seemed to unsettle Ethan more than the 9 languages themselves. He had spent years surrounded by people who carefully displayed their achievements. Avery was standing in a restaurant uniform, speaking about extraordinary ability as though it were nothing special. Then Martin suddenly looked up from the contract. His face had changed. Mr. Caldwell, he said quietly, she is right. Ethan's eyes returned to Avery. The room had not become smaller. The table had not changed. The contract was still worth $900 million. But the balance of power had shifted, and Avery Bennett, who had spent the entire evening serving everyone else, had just become the most important person in the room. The room had gone quiet, but Avery could still hear the faint clink of silverware from the dining room beyond the glass doors. Ethan Caldwell remained seated, one hand resting on the contract, the other pressed against the edge of the table. $900 million. 18 months. One hidden clause. A few minutes earlier, he had been certain the agreement was ready to sign. Now he was no longer certain of anything. Martin Hayes, his chief legal officer, read the disputed section again. Then again. His eyes moved slowly across the page. There is another problem, Martin said. Ethan looked up. What problem? Martin turned the tablet toward him. The wording changes in the second paragraph. If the licensing review happens after 18 months, the other company can request a new valuation based on market conditions. That could change the entire structure of the deal. Ethan leaned back. His jaw tightened. Across the table, the foreign executive who had been smiling earlier was suddenly very still. Avery noticed it immediately. She noticed everything. There is more, she said. Ethan looked at her. More? Avery nodded. The sentence before that one. Martin frowned. What about it? Avery stepped closer, careful not to interrupt anyone. It uses a formal expression that can mean 2 different things depending on context. The translation your team received chose the safer interpretation. Ethan asked, and the other interpretation? Avery looked toward the original document. It gives them room to challenge your ownership rights later. No one spoke. Ethan slowly turned to Martin. Did our legal team catch that? Martin shook his head. Not in this version. Avery stood quietly beside the table. She had no reason to be there. No title. No business card. No invitation. Yet she was reading a document that had taken months and millions of dollars to prepare. Ethan looked at her again. You said your mother taught you Spanish. Yes. What did she do? Avery paused. She translated medical documents and legal forms for families who could not afford private translators. Ethan listened carefully. And she taught you all 9 languages? Avery smiled faintly. Not all of them. She taught me how to learn. That answer stayed with him. It was not the answer of someone trying to impress a billionaire. It was the answer of someone who had learned that knowledge was not a trophy. It was a tool. Ethan asked, "Why are you working here?" Avery glanced toward the dining room. "Because I need the job." The simplicity of those words seemed to make the room uncomfortable. Ethan had expected a dramatic explanation, a hidden family fortune, a prestigious degree, some secret connection to the business world. Instead, there was just a young woman working long shifts because life still required rent, groceries, and responsibility. Martin closed the document. "We should postpone the signing." Ethan nodded. "Cancel it for tonight." The foreign executives immediately began speaking among themselves. Avery understood their conversation, but she said nothing. Ethan noticed her silence. "You understand what they are saying, don't you?" She looked at him. "Yes." "Are they upset?" "They are surprised." "About the contract?" Avery shook her head. "About me." Ethan looked around the table. That was the moment something deeper became clear. The problem was not simply that Avery knew 9 languages. The problem was that everyone in the room had already decided she was incapable of knowing anything important. Ethan had done the same thing. He had seen a uniform before he saw a person. Avery picked up her tray. "If that is everything, I should get back to work." Ethan stopped her. "Avery." She turned. He hesitated before asking the question. "How did you know to listen tonight?" Avery looked toward the contract, then back at him. "Because people speak differently when they think nobody understands them." Ethan said nothing. Avery walked away, her footsteps quiet against the polished floor. But the question remained behind her. How many times had powerful people revealed the truth simply because they believed no one in the room was listening? And for Ethan Caldwell, that question was about to become much more important than the contract itself. The restaurant slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but nothing felt usual anymore. Waiters moved between tables. Glasses caught the warm chandelier light. A soft piano melody continued in the background. Yet at Ethan Caldwell's table, the atmosphere had changed completely. The contract was closed. The $900 million deal was on hold. And the woman who had caused it all was back to carrying plates, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Ethan watched her from across the room. Avery did not look back. She delivered an appetizer to table 12, checked on an elderly couple near the window, and quietly refilled a water glass. No announcement. No smile of victory. No attempt to make anyone feel small. That bothered Ethan more than arrogance would have. He was accustomed to people wanting something from him. A promotion. An investment. An introduction. A favor. Avery had stopped a $900 million agreement and then returned to work. Ethan finally stood. Martin looked up. "Where are you going?" Ethan answered. "To ask her something." He crossed the dining room. But before he reached Avery, another server stepped beside her and whispered, "The private room needs coffee." Avery nodded. Then Ethan heard one of the executives behind him speaking quietly in another language. The words were casual, almost careless. Avery stopped for half a second. Ethan noticed. "What did he say?" Avery turned toward him. "Nothing important." Ethan gave her a questioning look. "You are sure?" Avery hesitated. "He said your team will probably find another translator tomorrow and continue the deal without me." Ethan's expression changed. "And what do you think?" Avery looked at the private dining room. "I think they will." "Why?" "Because people usually prefer familiar answers." Ethan studied her face. There was no bitterness in her voice. Only experience. He asked, "Would you have warned me again if I had signed?" Avery answered immediately. "Yes." "Even if it cost you your job?" She looked at him. "Yes." Ethan was silent. That answer was worth more to him than any polished speech he had heard that evening. Then something unexpected happened. The executive from the private room walked toward them. He spoke directly to Ethan, then glanced at Avery. Ethan looked at her. "He wants to know how you learned his language." Avery replied in the same language, calmly and naturally. The executive's eyebrows rose. He asked another question. Avery answered. Then another. She answered that one too. Ethan could not understand the words, but he could understand the reaction. The executive was no longer amused. He was listening. Finally, he turned to Ethan and said in English, "She understands the regional terminology better than our translation team." Ethan stared at him. Avery lowered her eyes. There are differences between textbook language and the way people actually speak, she explained, especially in business. Martin had followed Ethan into the dining room. He heard the explanation and immediately asked, "Could you review the entire agreement?" Avery looked at Ethan first. He nodded. "Please." She glanced toward her manager. "I am scheduled until midnight." Ethan checked his watch. It was 9:18 p.m. "Then we will make sure you are paid for every minute." Avery looked surprised. It was a small sentence. Almost ordinary. But for someone who had spent years being overlooked, ordinary respect could feel extraordinary. She followed them back toward the private room. The contract waited on the table. So did the people who had doubted her. But this time, Avery did not stand behind anyone. She took a chair beside the legal team, opened the document, and began reading. Ethan watched her for a moment. Then he noticed something he had missed before. Avery was not nervous. She was focused, calm, prepared. And as she reached the final pages, her expression changed. She stopped. Her finger rested on one sentence. "Mr. Caldwell," she said quietly, "I think we have a bigger problem." Ethan leaned closer. "What is it?" Avery looked at the page. This clause was not accidentally translated incorrectly. The room went still again. Someone changed it. And suddenly, the $900 million contract was no longer just a language problem. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Avery kept her finger on the sentence while Ethan stood beside the table, reading the same line again and again. The warm restaurant lighting suddenly felt colder. Martin pulled his chair closer. "What makes you think it was changed?" he asked. Avery pointed to two phrases. "These words do not belong together. The grammar is correct, but the legal meaning is inconsistent with the rest of the document." Martin opened the earlier draft on his laptop. He compared the pages side by side. His expression slowly changed. "The wording is different." Ethan looked at him. "How different?" "Enough to matter." Avery remained quiet. She did not need to explain what everyone could now see. Someone had taken a legitimate translation and altered one section before it reached Ethan's team. The question was no longer whether the contract was flawed. The question was who had changed it and why. Ethan looked around the private dining room. 6 executives had been discussing the deal for nearly 2 hours. Every one of them had access to the documents. Every one of them had a reason to want the agreement signed quickly. Avery looked at the original version again. "There is something else." Ethan turned toward her. "What?" "The mistake is too precise." Martin frowned. "What do you mean?" Avery explained carefully. "A normal translation error would create awkward wording. This does not. Someone chose a phrase that sounds natural in English, but carries a different meaning in the original language." Martin leaned back. "That would require someone who understands both languages." Avery nodded. "Yes." Ethan's eyes moved toward the executive who had earlier questioned why he was listening to a waitress. The man sat quietly, his hands folded on the table. Ethan did not accuse him. Not yet. Instead, he asked Avery, "Can you identify who made the change?" She shook her head. "Not from the document alone." Then she looked at the metadata on the digital file. "But I can tell you when it happened." Martin quickly opened the file history. Avery watched the screen. "There," she said. A timestamp appeared. 6:42 p.m. Ethan checked his watch. It was now 9:27 p.m. "That was before dinner," Martin said. Avery nodded. "And after the final legal review." Ethan's face became serious. "Who had access at 6:42? Martin checked the records. One name appeared. Then another. Then a third. Ethan stared at the list. The foreign executive remained silent. The room seemed to shrink around them. Avery suddenly noticed something else. "Wait." She leaned closer to the screen. The file was opened at 6:42, but it was not edited until 6:49. Martin checked again. "You are right. And the person who opened it at 6:42 is not the same person who edited it." Ethan looked at Martin. "Can you trace the second user?" Martin hesitated. "I can try." Avery looked at the document again. She was no longer thinking about languages. She was thinking about patterns. Her mother had taught her that understanding words was only the beginning. You had to understand why people chose them. Why one phrase instead of another. Why one sentence appeared where it did. Why someone wanted another person to believe something that was not true. Avery looked up at Ethan. I think the contract was designed to make you believe you were getting 10 years of control. Ethan nodded slowly. And actually, 18 months. Martin opened another page. There is a second clause. Avery read it. Her eyes narrowed. That one is worse. Ethan stepped closer. What does it say? Avery looked at him. It gives them the right to renegotiate the technology valuation after 18 months. Ethan's expression hardened. How much could that cost? Martin calculated silently, then answered. Potentially hundreds of millions more. The room fell silent again. Ethan looked at Avery, the waitress he had barely noticed an hour earlier. You just saved this company from a very expensive mistake. Avery shook her head. I only read what was already there. Ethan gave a quiet nod. But before he could say anything else, Avery noticed a message appear on Martin's screen. He read it once. Then his face went pale. Mr. Caldwell, he said, we found who edited the contract. Ethan looked at him. Who? Martin slowly turned the screen around. The name belonged to someone sitting at their table. The name on the screen was Daniel Mercer. Ethan stared at it without speaking. Daniel was not a stranger. He was the senior vice president who had worked beside Ethan for almost 7 years. He was also the person who had introduced the foreign executives to Caldwell Innovations. Martin looked from the screen to Ethan. The access record is clear, he said. Daniel opened the file at 6:42 p.m. and edited it 7 minutes later. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair. That does not prove anything. His voice was controlled, almost casual. Avery stood quietly beside the table. She watched him, not his face, but his hands. He kept touching the same corner of his folder. Once, twice, 3 times. She recognized the nervous rhythm. She had seen it before in people who were trying to remember which version of a story they had already told. Ethan asked, Did you edit the contract? Daniel looked directly at him. No. Martin turned the laptop toward him. The system says otherwise. Daniel glanced at the screen. Then the system is wrong. Nobody answered. The restaurant around them continued moving as if nothing had happened. A server passed with a tray of sparkling water. Someone laughed near the bar. A piano key sounded softly in the distance. Inside the private room, however, every second felt heavier. Ethan looked at Avery. Can you read the original clause again? She nodded. She read it slowly in the original language, then translated the meaning into English. Daniel interrupted. That is not what it means. Avery turned toward him. Which part? He pointed to a phrase. That expression has another interpretation. Avery considered his words for a moment. It does, but not in this context. Daniel stopped. Ethan noticed. Why not? Avery answered before Daniel could. Because the sentence uses a formal legal structure. In this context, the phrase means the company can reopen the valuation. It does not simply mean they can review the agreement. Daniel leaned forward. You are making assumptions. Avery remained calm. No, I am explaining the grammar. Martin checked the original contract. Then he checked the translation. His eyes widened. She is right. Ethan looked at Daniel. Why would you change it? Daniel shook his head. I did not. Avery studied the document once more. Then she noticed a small detail. Wait. Everyone looked at her. There is a second account attached to the edit. Martin opened the access history. A second name appeared beneath Daniel's. Daniel opened the file, Martin said. But another user made the final change. Ethan's expression shifted. Who? Martin looked at the screen. Someone from outside the company. Avery leaned closer. Can you see the location? Martin nodded. A translation office in Brooklyn. Avery's eyes moved across the screen. What time? 6:49 p.m. She looked at Ethan. That is 7 minutes after Daniel opened the file. Ethan turned to Daniel. Why did you open the document? Daniel answered immediately. I was reviewing the final version. Avery asked quietly. Did you send it anywhere? Daniel hesitated. Only for a moment. But everyone saw it. I sent it to our translation vendor. Martin shook his head. That vendor was not authorized to edit the legal version. Ethan stood still, absorbing the information. Then Avery noticed another line in the access history. Her expression changed. Mr. Caldwell. Ethan looked at her. What now? She pointed to the screen. The outside account did not create the altered translation. Martin checked the record. Then what did it do? Avery answered softly. It uploaded a replacement file. Ethan looked at Daniel. Replacement for what? Avery looked at the contract. For the version your legal team approved. Silence filled the room again. Ethan finally understood the pattern. Someone had not made a careless mistake. Someone had replaced the document after the legal review, then allowed the altered version to reach the dinner table. Daniel lowered his eyes. Ethan asked, "Who authorized the replacement?" Martin searched the records. His fingers stopped above the keyboard. "The request came from your executive office." Ethan frowned. "My office?" Martin nodded. Avery remained silent. Then Ethan slowly looked at her. She had found the language problem. She had found the altered clause. She had found the second account. And now she was staring at the access record as though she had noticed something none of them had. "Avery," Ethan said, "what are you seeing?" She took a breath. The file was replaced at 6:49 p.m. She pointed to another timestamp. But the email authorizing it was sent at 6:31 p.m. Ethan looked confused. That means someone knew the file would be changed before anyone opened it. Avery nodded. Exactly. The room went silent. This was no longer about a translation. It was about intent. And somewhere between 6:31 p.m. and 6:49 p.m., someone had already decided what Ethan Caldwell was supposed to believe. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but Ethan felt as though the entire evening had shifted beneath him. He looked at the timestamp again. 6:31 p.m. Someone had authorized a change before Daniel even opened the file. That meant the altered contract had been planned. Not discovered. Not accidental. Planned. Martin closed the access history and immediately opened the internal authorization system. "I can trace the approval," he said. Ethan nodded. Avery remained beside the table, watching the screen. She had learned long ago that important information often hid inside ordinary details. A timestamp, a repeated phrase, a name appearing where it should not. Martin entered the authorization code. The system loaded slowly. Then a name appeared. "Victoria Shaw," he said. Ethan's expression changed. Victoria was the executive director of international partnerships. She had been with Caldwell Innovations for 12 years. Ethan trusted her with some of the company's most sensitive negotiations. "That cannot be right," Ethan said. Martin checked again. The authorization came from her account. Daniel looked toward Ethan. Maybe her account was compromised. Avery spoke quietly. "Maybe." Everyone looked at her. She continued. "But there is something you should check first." Ethan asked, "What?" Avery pointed to the file history. The person who requested the replacement knew exactly which sentence to change. Martin nodded slowly. So whoever did this understood the original agreement. She looked at Daniel. And they understood both languages. Daniel's expression became guarded. "You are suggesting someone inside the company worked with the translation vendor." Avery shook her head. "I am saying the change was too precise to be random." Ethan walked toward the window. Manhattan stretched below him. Thousands of lights scattered across the darkness. $900 million had seemed like the biggest thing in the room when the evening began. Now it felt strangely small compared with what they had uncovered. He turned back. "Martin, call Victoria." Martin hesitated. Now. The call connected after 3 rings. Victoria answered from somewhere in Midtown. "Ethan, is everything all right?" Ethan looked at Avery before responding. "We found a problem with the contract." A pause. "What kind of problem?" "A translation problem." Another pause. "I thought legal approved everything." Martin placed the call on speaker. Avery listened carefully. Victoria sounded calm. Too calm. Ethan asked, "Did you authorize a replacement file at 6:31? Victoria answered immediately. "No." Martin looked at the screen. "The system shows your account." Victoria replied. "Then someone used my credentials." Ethan asked, "Who has access?" "Only 3 people." Martin looked at Ethan. "Daniel, me, and Victoria." Daniel crossed his arms. "This is becoming ridiculous." Avery looked at him. "Can I ask one question?" Daniel glanced at her. "What? Why did you send the file to the translation vendor before the legal team finished the review?" Daniel did not answer immediately. Ethan noticed. Martin noticed. Even Victoria, still on speaker, went silent. Finally Daniel said, Because the clients requested a bilingual copy. Avery nodded. They requested a bilingual copy, but not an edited legal version. Daniel looked at Ethan. I did not change anything. Avery believed that part. At least partly. She turned toward the laptop. Then someone used your access to make it look like you did. Ethan asked, why would they do that? Avery looked at the contract. Because whoever planned this wanted suspicion to fall on someone inside the company. Martin frowned. Daniel. Avery nodded. Possibly. Daniel looked offended. You think I am part of this? Avery answered calmly. I think someone wanted us to think you were. Ethan studied her. She was not accusing anyone. She was following the evidence. That distinction mattered. Then Victoria suddenly spoke through the laptop. Ethan, wait. Everyone froze. There is one thing you should know. Ethan stepped closer. What? Victoria's voice became quieter. The translation vendor was recommended by someone in your executive office 6 months ago. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Who? Victoria hesitated. Then she said, your former chief of staff. Ethan stared at the screen. His former chief of staff had left the company 3 months earlier. He had also been the person who originally negotiated the foreign partnership. Avery looked at the contract again. Something was beginning to make sense. The language, the timing, the vendor, the authorization, for pieces that seemed unrelated until they were placed together. She whispered, the person who changed this document may not be trying to steal the company. Ethan looked at her. Then what are they trying to do? Avery met his eyes. They are trying to make you sign something that benefits someone else. The words hung in the room. Someone else was benefiting. Ethan looked at the contract, then at Avery, and finally at Martin. The answer was no longer hiding in the language alone. It was hiding in the reason someone had chosen those particular words. If they wanted me to lose money, why make the agreement look attractive? Ethan asked. Avery considered the question. Because you would never sign a bad deal if it looked bad. Martin nodded slowly. They needed you to believe you were getting something valuable. Avery pointed to the licensing section. The first 18 months are actually favorable to you. That is why the 10-year language is convincing. Whoever designed this knew you would focus on the long-term value. Ethan stared at the page. So the trap was hidden inside the part that looked safest. Yes, Avery said. And there is another reason. She turned to the final pages. They expected you to sign tonight. Martin looked at the clock. It was 9:41 p.m. Why tonight? Avery answered. Because tomorrow the foreign delegation returns home. Ethan's expression changed. Which means there would be pressure to finalize everything before they leave. Avery nodded. Exactly. The room became quiet again. Ethan walked back to the table and sat down. He had built his company by making decisions quickly. He had learned to trust instinct, numbers, and people who had earned his confidence. But tonight, speed had almost become a weakness. Avery watched him carefully. She could see the question behind his eyes. What would you do? He finally asked. She looked surprised. I am not the person who should make that decision. You already made one tonight. Avery shook her head. I noticed something. You made the decision to listen. Ethan said nothing. Then Martin received another message. He opened it and read silently. The former chief of staff just contacted the translation vendor. Ethan looked up. When? 7 minutes ago. Avery frowned. After we discovered the altered file? Martin nodded. Yes. Ethan asked, what did he say? Martin read the message again. He asked whether the contract had been signed. Avery's eyes moved to the document. That is important. Ethan turned toward her. Why? Because he should not know the contract is still on the table unless someone told him. Martin looked at the access records. The only people who knew the signing was delayed were everyone in this room and the legal team. Ethan's eyes moved around the table. The foreign executives were still waiting. Daniel remained silent. Victoria was still connected by phone. Avery stood near the contract, calm but alert. Then the restaurant manager appeared at the doorway. Mr. Caldwell? Ethan turned. Yes. There is a gentleman outside asking for you. Ethan frowned. Who? The manager hesitated. He says he used to work for you. Ethan stood. Did he give you his name? Yes. The manager looked toward the hallway. Michael Grant. Ethan stopped. Michael was the former chief of staff. He had left the company 3 months earlier without explaining why. He had never returned to the restaurant. Not once. Where is he? Ethan asked. In the lobby. Ethan looked at Avery. Stay here. Avery nodded. He took 2 steps toward the door, then stopped. Actually, come with me. Avery looked surprised. Me? Ethan nodded. You found the problem. I want you to hear what he has to say. They walked through the restaurant together. The room seemed brighter than before. Conversations continued around them. Nobody knew that a $900 million deal had nearly changed the future of a company. Nobody knew that the quiet waitress walking beside the billionaire CEO had uncovered the first real clue. At the lobby, Ethan saw Michael Grant standing near the marble reception desk. Michael turned. His expression changed when he saw Avery beside Ethan. Just for a second. But Avery noticed. She always noticed. Michael smiled carefully. Ethan, we need to talk. Ethan stopped several feet away. About the contract? Michael glanced at Avery. About a mistake. Avery felt the words settle in the air. Ethan asked, whose mistake? Michael looked directly at him. Yours. Avery's eyes narrowed. She said nothing. Michael continued. You are about to walk away from the biggest international opportunity your company has ever had. Ethan answered calmly. That depends on which version of the contract you mean. Michael's smile disappeared, and for the first time that night, Avery realized the person who had planned the entire situation might have underestimated one thing. Ethan was no longer listening only to his executives. He was listening to her. Michael Grant stood beneath the warm lobby lights, one hand resting casually beside his coat pocket, as though he had walked into the restaurant expecting a routine conversation. But Ethan knew better. Michael had not come there by accident. You said I made a mistake, Ethan said. Explain. Michael glanced at Avery again. This is a private business matter. Ethan did not move. Then speak openly. Michael sighed. The foreign partnership is worth hundreds of millions. If you walk away tonight, your competitors will take it. Avery watched him carefully. His words were confident, but his eyes kept moving toward the contract Ethan still held. You seem very interested in that document, she said quietly. Michael looked at her. And you seem very interested in a business you do not understand. Ethan's expression changed. Avery remained calm. I understand enough to know that the original agreement and the version on that table are not the same. Michael looked at Ethan. You are really going to trust her? Ethan answered without hesitation. She is the reason I have not signed yet. The lobby became strangely quiet. Michael took a breath. Ethan, you are letting one unusual observation derail a $900 million deal. Avery looked at him. It was not one observation. Michael turned toward her. What was it then? 9. He frowned. 9 what? 9 languages. Avery spoke softly. 9 ways to hear what people mean, not just what they say. Ethan looked at her, and for the first time that night, he understood the deeper value of what she had done. She had not simply translated words. She had recognized intention. Michael became silent. Ethan asked, Did you authorize the translation vendor? Michael shook his head. No. Did you know the contract had been replaced? No. Did you contact the vendor 7 minutes ago? Michael hesitated. That hesitation answered more than words could. Ethan remained calm. Why? Michael finally looked down. Because I wanted to know whether the agreement had been signed. Why? Because I was trying to protect the company. Avery watched him. By making the contract look different? Michael looked at her. You do not understand the business. Avery answered. Maybe not all of it. But I understand language. And I understand when someone is avoiding a direct answer. Ethan turned toward Martin, who had just entered the lobby. Can you confirm the original contract? Martin nodded. Yes. And we have already secured the records. Ethan looked back at Michael. The deal is suspended. Michael's shoulders dropped slightly. You are making a mistake. Ethan shook his head. No. Tonight, I almost made one. He glanced at Avery. She stopped me. Michael followed his gaze. Something in his expression softened. You really trust her? Ethan answered. I trust evidence. She found it. Avery did not smile. She simply stood there, holding the same silver tray she had carried all evening. The contrast was almost impossible to miss. A billionaire CEO, a former chief of staff, a $900 million contract, and a waitress who had never been invited into the conversation until she spoke. Ethan turned to Avery. I owe you an apology. She looked surprised. For what? For seeing your uniform before seeing your ability. Avery was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You are not the first person to do that. Ethan nodded. I know. He looked toward the private dining room, where the executives were still waiting. Then he made a decision. Tomorrow morning, I want you in my office. Avery hesitated. As a waitress? Ethan shook his head. As someone who knows something we clearly needed. She looked at him carefully. I still need my job. Ethan smiled for the first time that evening. Then you will have it. But if you are willing, I would like to offer you something else. Avery did not answer immediately. She looked through the glass doors toward the dining room, then back at the billionaire standing in front of her. She had spent years being overlooked. Tonight, she had not demanded a seat at the table. She had simply earned one by knowing what nobody else noticed. Ethan held out his hand. Thank you, Avery. She looked at his hand, then accepted it. No applause. No celebration. Just a quiet moment between two people who had entered the evening seeing each other very differently. And somewhere behind them, on a table beneath the Manhattan lights, a $900 million contract remained unsigned. But something far more valuable had already been discovered. Intelligence does not need a title, talent does not need permission, and sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the one person capable of seeing the truth.